Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 119th chapter in the book of Psalms. The range we most recently covered were verses 33 through 48, and the way that the 119th psalm is arranged is in an acrostic order. An acrostic is a poetic device whereby the first letter of a verse corresponds with a word in the order in which they appear in the Hebrew language. This is the Hebrew language. So the letters we most recently covered was He and Wa, and there are 22 letters in the Hebrew language. They only have vowels. They don't have vowels. Vowels are categorically excluded. It's all consonants. And this is one big love ballad for the law. The law is the psalmist, who is anonymous. We don't know who. He's not identified in the title, but whoever he was, he really loved the law, and it's just about the centrality of the law in his life. And to the inhabitants of the most previous dispensation, the fifth dispensation, that of law, the law was this most special form of special revelation. This was prior to the coming of the Messiah, who fulfilled the law and is the fullest, final, most complete and perfect expression in form of revelation of who divinity is. But this was in all likelihood dated in the post-exilic period, and one plausible candidate may have been Ezra. I don't want to rule out the possibility. I don't want to outright endorse it either. We're just going to review what we already covered. Verse 33, "Teach me, O Yahweh, the words of your laws, and I observe it to the end." He approaches him not only from as an object of worship, but also as a student to the teacher. He desires to know his law. The law is his lifelong pursuits and study and source of satisfaction. He's determined to live by it and die by it all the way till the end, but he wants to know everything there is to know, and his knowledge is incomplete. So you can spend a lifetime studying the law and still and still be open to new insights and new learnings. "Make me understand that I might observe your Torah and guard it with all my heart." So he knows that only divinity can impart the knowledge, wisdom, and intelligence to understand and apply. Observe is the application. That's when we don't merely observe it by reading, but we observe it in practice. So we go out and live by what we learned. And he wants to guard it with all his heart. And the heart is the center of human volition, will, emotion, desire, and passion. And he had a burning hot, intense passion for the law, his love of the law. "Make me walk in the paths of your commandments, for I have delighted in it." So he genuinely has a source of pleasure in observing and obeying and studying and learning and living these commandments, but he knows that apart from Yahweh, the natural man, the dictates and the orders of the law are so counterintuitive to the natural man's inclination that to arbitrarily arrive at a correct application almost defies the laws of chance. So even those who teach the law, the psalmist clearly was a teacher of the law, but he was also a student, and woe unto the teacher who ceases to be a student. Verse 40, this is the close of the He acrostic. The 176 verses of the 119th Psalm are divided into 22 categories of 8. That's how we get the number. "See, I have longed for your orders. Revive me in your righteousness." So the law is a revelation not of our own righteousness, but of that of Yahweh, and it's a concrete expression of his will and nature and character. And we cannot revive ourselves in our own righteousness. Now, the danger of approaching the law excessively is that if you approach it to the extreme of legalism, then you develop the traits of self-righteousness. This psalmist did not lose sight and focus that the law was a revelation of Yahweh's righteousness and not his own. His righteousness can revive us from death unto the resurrection. We have to long for it. We have to yearn for it. We have to sincerely desire, and not only desire, but make the effort to learn and live by his orders. Verse 43, this is the section which corresponds to the Hebrew letter Wa. "And do not take away from my mouth the word of truth entirely, for I have waited for your judgments." So the word, his word is truth, and his word is truth, as is communicated in John 17:17. Sanctify them by thy word is truth. But, to remove it entirely would be torturous to a man who had learned and lived and grown in the truth of the word. He had made it his lifelong pursuit, object, and study, and he just doesn't want to lose it completely. And he reminds him that I have longed with patience for your justice, and that is an act of faith, because the psalmist, whoever he was no stranger to persecution, as we read in the section we're going to cover today in the lesson itself. That I might guard your Torah continually, forever and ever. So the Torah was not a once a day, 1 day a week fad. It was a 365 day a year, 24/7 gig for the psalmist. The element of perpetuity is expressed in the word continually and forever and ever. And the law is an eternal expression. It emanates from an eternal being, and it is his eternal ways, and his ways are unchanging. And we get a glimpse into Revelation. Verse 46, that I might speak of your witness before kings and not be ashamed. So the psalmist prayed for the opportunities to have to give an answer, an account for the law that he lived by before witnesses. This mimics what we read, or the New Testament rather mimics it, of what the in Saul's calling. Before Paul became known as Paul, he was known as Saul. That was his Hebrew name. Paul was his Gentile name. He would be his witness before kings, Acts 9:15. And also in the Mount Olivet Discourse, the Savior warns the disciples, both present and future, that they may be called to give a witness and a testimony before the civil authorities, and at that moment in time they will be they are instructed not to take any premeditation of what they say, but they are promised that the impartation of the Spirit's presence will be with them and speak to them on their behalf. Verse 48, that I might lift up my hands to your commandments, which I have loved, while I meditate on your laws. To lift up your hands is an act of praise. That is an act of worship. That's what to lift up your hands signalizes that you ascribe worth to something. So we lift up our hands to the one who is above it, but he also lifts up his hands to his commandments. He praises them, he adores them, he adulates them, he loves them, he takes pleasure and delight in them. They are a source of happiness and satisfaction. And the practice of meditation, now the Hebrew word for meditate translates as mutter. So the ancient Jews, when they meditated, they would mutter the word and stimulate thought based on the muttering. So it was not a completely silent practice as we understood, but it was still legitimate and valid nevertheless. Verse 49, lesson itself, letter, corresponds to the Hebrew letter of Zion, which is the 7th letter in their 22-letter alphabet. And it opens with the word remember, and that word appears some 15 times in the book of Deuteronomy. This is the encapsulation of the Torah. Deuteronomy translates as the retelling or the recycling of the law. And it's Moses' final farewell address, and that word, remember, appears 15 times in that book, and the word forget appears 14 times. There are some things in our past we need to forget, forsake, in order to lay claim of the future. There are other things we must remember. So the nation that was about to settle in the promised land had to remember the failings of the wilderness wanderings, the Exodus ancestors. And but in reference to divinity, he is an omniscient being, and as such, he is literally incapable of forgetting anything or ever not knowing any item of information which has existed or even has existed yet. But for him to remember us is to work on our behalfs and to pay attention with special concern, be actively involved in our lives. Remember the word to your servant, on which you have caused me to wait. So what he wants him to remember is the word. The promise and the word are synonymous in this instance. And the word, one of the fantastic positive aspects of the word is the promises which are contained therein. And the psalmist considered himself not only a student, but a servant. He had the mentality, a disciple mimics the master, a servant has a master, so discipleship is very much the life of servitude. And once more, he expresses that he cannot get enough. He is beyond patient. He endures. He has an element of constant yearning, constant longing, and constant consuming on the word that he wants, that he takes pains to remember, and he wants Yahweh just to remember the fact that he is giving all his effort to remember his words. And the psalmist knows that he cannot understand it apart from him, and he has his focus and concentration in the right place, shall we say. This is my comfort in my afflictions, for your word has given me life. The Christian joy is not contingent upon circumstances, for even in negative circumstances and situations, we can look beyond our situation to the one who transcends all circumstances, and we are promised the Comforter, the Ruach Kadesh. That is one of his titles. He ministers to the heart. He provides comfort when we are being persecuted, and the Spirit is what enables us to endure the hatred and hostility of the world, as we read of in John 15, 18, 19. But what was true for the disciples of the new dispensation is true in the old. Comfort for the affliction for the comforted, and comforted for the affliction can be summarized. The prophetic message, the formula can be found of that paradox, originates from Deuteronomy. But the word is a wellspring of life, so even as we feel our quality of life is deteriorating, or if our life is not working out the way we planned or the way we expected or the way that we hoped to, we can have nourishment in spiritual life from his word, which will sustain us and enable us to endure past our present circumstances. The proud have utterly scorned me. I did not turn aside from your Torah. Pride is a sin. It was the original sin of Lucifer. He was famous for his beauty and wisdom until one day he got sick of being number two, and his great pride compelled him to launch his rebellion, and that is the original sin in the universe. Original sin, that term is not biblical, but it is traced to St. Augustine, meaning the sin that lies in our origins, but I like to refer to that as the fall. But to the point of the passage, the psalmist is ridiculed, rejected, despised, outcast, ostracized by the proud, the ones who had pull and leverage in the world and influence and power and prestige, but he did not forsake his Torah, which was perhaps the root of the ridicule and the persecution and the reproach that he was enduring because of his fastidious adherence and his unashamed proclamation of his love for the law that we can imagine was the root of his persecution. I remembered your judgments of old, O Yahweh, and I comforted myself. So the psalmist remembers, he looks back and longs and has the memory implanted. Even when the book is not in front of our noses, we can have the memory of what we read, which will come to us in certain situations, and that's when we will live what we learn, when we apply what we intuit. But the judgments are of old. They are connected to eternal being, the principles and the truth. The truth is by its very nature eternally binding because it emanates from an eternal being. But he has a source of comfort and delight and just spiritual shalom from the act of remembering what he has read. So you have to read, then you remember what you read, and you'll open opportunities, you'll spot opportunities in your life to make the most of what you have read. If you and you will remember what you read, and it will make the meaningful application in that certain situation. Rage has seized me because of the wicked who forsake your Torah. This is righteous indignation. Angry is not always necessarily sinful. It is right that we be angry, that children go to bed hungry, that there is war and suffering and disease and chaos and inequality throughout the world and oppression, that we have every right to be angry. Now, we also read in the New Testament, let not the sun go down on thy wrath. So we shouldn't lose sleep over the conditions which are beyond our control, but we should also be angry at their existence, and we should be especially angry when we see our brothers who came to a saving knowledge in the truth, and to forsake that That should, we shouldn't be happy, we shouldn't bask in it, we shouldn't take delight and satisfaction in the fact that there are those who know the word, the Torah. The word is also synonymous, and reject the word and forsake it and no longer abide by it. We should be angry that those people are out there. Your laws have been my songs in the place of my sojournings. So he has a song of praise on the tip of his tongue wherever he goes, wherever he is. The law is foundational to the songs, and this psalm is not to be read as musical poetry. Most of the psalms are originally composed and compiled to be sung in acts of liturgical worship. This psalm is meditative. It is meant to be read, not sung. The ultimate value can come from reading it. Even though we read the songs, what were once songs, as poetry, the book of Psalms, they were originally oriented towards musical lyrics. We can read information on the tunes they were set to or the instruments that would have been played in many of the titles. But wherever he goes, wherever he is, he has the law on his mind and a song on the tip of his tongue, because where the law is, there too is his song, so he can always sing, even when life is unpleasant at the present moment. This has become mine because I have observed your orders. So all the blessings, all the privileges, all the fantastic claims and promises belong to him, and it is contingent on his obedience and observance of his orders. Orders is one of the 8 terms, those being law, laws plural, statutes, precepts, commands, commandments, ordinances, decrees, and words. These are the 8 synonyms of the law or the word that we read here. And he observed them, he applied them, he obeyed them, he learned them, and lived them. This marks the beginning of the section of Heth, which is the 8th letter in the Hebrew alphabet. So every one of these from verses 57 to 64, the opening letter of the opening word, begins in the Hebrew original with that letter. You are my portion, O Yahweh. I have promised to guard your words. Portion, that term is used in reference to the Levites. They had no land, they had no property, they had no inheritance, but Yahweh was their portion or inheritance. And to paraphrase the 20th century Methodist author A.W. Tozer, in making them his inheritance, they were wealthier than all the Rajas and all the princes who ever walked the earth. So our inheritance in him, if our inheritance is of the earth, how poor are we? How much greater and eternally efficacious is to have him as our portion and our inheritance. And we have to, his promises, we are not saved by our promises to him. We are saved by his promises to us. But this psalmist took it upon himself to make a promise. And when you make a promise to divinity, you better be sure that you keep it. But this promise was not in vain. There are serious consequences for violating vows that you make, but this psalmist was correct to affirm that he had been faithful in his promise to keep his words. He had been surrounded by temptation to forsake them, being surrounded in a country that had forsaken the law that they had been given to live by. He did not forsake it, and he kept it at all times in all places in spite of unpleasant circumstances. So in health, wealth, prosperity, sickness, and decline, he kept his word. I have sought your face with all my heart. Show me grace according to your word. So to seek with all your heart is knock and it shall be open, seek and you shall find. But this is not these promises ought not be interpreted in the lazy minimalist thing we have to do. We have to actively search with energy, all our faculties and all their capacities. But if we seek his face, then we will find him. This promise is made in Deuteronomy 4:29 and also the Jeremiah 29:13, whether in the exile, and this is written post-exile. But seek and we will find, and finding we will be satisfied. And the grace according to the word, the word is an act of grace. He did not have to deign to provide us with basic instructions before leaving earth, but it is an act of grace for him to do so. That is an acronym for the Bible, and much of the 119th Psalm is somewhat acronymous, but it is more accurately an acrostic. I have thought upon my ways and turned my feet to your witness. The psalmist was in the practice of daily and rigorous moral inventory. At the end of the night, we have to catalog our behavior and our failures and our mistakes and really differentiate between the sins. Mistakes are not as concerning as sins, but we do sin throughout the day. Oftentimes we don't notice. That's why I recommend the practice of daily rigorous moral inventory. Review everything you said, everything you did, everything you thought at the end of the day, and then you will have a barometer of your spiritual progress. And always turn to his witnesses. The witnesses are in this book. Our faith is contingent not on something we witness, but something that other witnesses. We did not see the resurrection, but we have faith because we trust the witness of those who wrote of it. And not just the resurrection, but everything that is written in the Old Testament. I have hurried and did not delay to keep your commandments. His obedience is light speed. He cannot get there far enough. He cannot get there fast enough. There's an element of urgency in his words, hurrying and not delaying to keep your commands. Now, we cannot just cherry pick when and which one we will obey, when and where we choose. We have to not delay. We can not allow the opportunity to escape it, to keep the commandment. And if there's no challenge in keeping the commandment, then there's no value to keeping commandments. Commandments are good because they are difficult, and he seldom asks. He wants the very best for us, so he commands the very best. He demands the best standards for us in order that we may lay claim to the best promises that he has to offer. The cords of the wicked have surrounded me. Your Torah I have not forgotten. Christians exist in the world, but we are not of the world. We exist apart and from the world, and the world is surrounded and succumbed by wickedness. Wickedness is the definition of the worldly system, and human nature is desperately wicked, the human heart, Jeremiah 17:9. So this psalmist, whenever he's outside of the sanctuary, whenever he's in the world, he feels surrounded by hostile forces of wickedness and evil, yet he always continually takes refuge and solace and comfort and sanctuary in the law, the meditation thereof. Even if he doesn't have a portable copy of it, he has his memory, he's familiar with enough of it, he has read and it researched, and it still registers in his mind. So that's always there for him, no matter what life throws at you, no matter what Satan throws at you. The word will protect us and preserve us in all circumstances and situations. At midnight I rise to give thanks to you for your righteous right judgments. This, I think 7 times a day we elsewhere read that the psalmist was in the practice of praying, and I'm not in the personal practice of counting the number of times I pray. I don't pray as needed. I pray when I am reminded to pray. So oftentimes, it's difficult to remember to pray as I go about through the day. But oftentimes, when I need help, then I will ask for it. If something's, if I'm anticipating the worst possible outcome and scenario, I will pray. And I will pray often when I have no reason to pray, just to keep in the practice of gratitude, because if you are grateful for your salvation, you will not lose it. If you lose sight of the gratitude, then you will. But this psalmist was in the practice all day, every day, and throughout the day, including at midnight. So from start to finish, he was a man of prayer, and his prayers, his petitions were expressions of gratitude. When you have no enterprise that you want Elohim to bless, you can always give him thanks for all that he is and all that he has done and all that he will continue to do. Thank him in advance for what he has yet to fulfill, his promise, just the provision of the promise. And and we should remain grateful to that his justice is perfect and transcends any earthly variant. I am a companion of all who revere you, and those guarding your orders. The principle of association, according to which this psalmist lived his life by, was to surround himself with like-minded people who feared and revered Yahweh and learned and lived by his law and taught his law and were students of it, were seekers of him, and those who kept his orders. Now, the majority of human nature is disobedient the human race is disobedient and rebellious, so our options are somewhat selective. If we want to surround ourselves with good people and positive, powerful influences, we have to reject certain people from our associations. This does not mean that we should have no ministry to lost sinners. It is only to suggest that the only reason we should be affiliating with them is to win them to salvation. 64th and final verse of this lesson. O Yahweh, your kindness has filled the earth. Teach me your laws. This echoes actually, because we believe that this psalm was written post-exilic, the prophecy of the calling, when Isaiah was called in the 6th chapter in the book which bears his name. The seraphim descended in the heavenly temple, and they said, "Sacred, sacred, sacred, the whole earth is filled with your esteem." And kindness is another word that is synonymous with esteem. But that either means that the world is corrupt from its pristine order, but nevertheless the traces and the fingerprints of divinity remain in it and give it its splendor and glory and estimation and value. And the psalmist, once more, is a student, so he teaches the law. He's probably an authority. He's a priest. He teaches the law and lives by the law, but he also learns the law, and his teacher is Yahweh. And in 1 John 2:20 and 27, we read that we needn't have any human teacher inasmuch as we have the Spirit. That does not suggest that we categorically exclude and exile human teachers from teaching us, only we must accept them only inasmuch by testing the spirits and determining that they are in fact spirit-saturated teachings. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.